Mind if I jack into your power strip? Oh, today? Looked on the house calendar and it wasn't there earlier. I'll double check. That's not true. I got a little confused now. I don't know what more day it is.
Oh, really?
What are you doing? Are you rich?
Yes, I'm rich.
Oh,
What are you doing here? Is anybody sitting by you?
you are.
I'll scoot over. We can pretend we like each other.
Did you talk to him?
This is his first meeting.
Yeah, I know.
Now, I just
You don't need one then. Yeah. Do you need one? I think I have it. Everyone else?
Source.
I think I need one more, Barbara. Yeah, but that's okay. I can use it if need be probably. Well, or I'll just make sure I grab it on my way out.
So yeah, that is.
Did you go through the wine thing?
That was. Which day? I do like what was it? And
Right there, Mr. Chairman.
it's always fine.
But anyway.
Yeah, but it's, yeah. And this is.
Well, did you slip and slide any coming in? I came up that hill coming in Jefferson City. I didn't do anything. Just good enough, you could start to see the tracks and kind of lines on the road, you can see the tracks in it. How'd you do that?
One day.
One voter. Okay. Whereabouts were you at?
Sure.
I love those guys. I've got some cousins out there. They don't talk to.
Oh, no,
I've never heard of them. There's a section over here. And I think they were there. Okay, we'll call the meeting professional registration, governmental organizations and elections to order. I appreciate the committee members coming in. We missed last Monday, we missed this Monday, so that's why the Tuesday thing. Hopefully this won't happen very often, very frequently. But anyway, that's why we're doing this on Tuesday. So if we could have a roll call, please.
Senators Wasson.
Here.
Cunningham.
Here.
Hageman.
Here.
Kraus.
Here.
Riddle. Sater.
Here.
Wallingford.
Here.
Wheeland.
Here.
Kennedy. Shute. Sifton.
Okay, I believe we have a quorum. We're going to go right into it because we're going to be limited on time. There's another committee that has this space at 3 o'clock, so we got to hustle. Senator Kraus will call Senate Committee Substitute Senate Bill 594 and I guess SJR 20 at the same time. Do them both together.
Thank you. May proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to hear these two important bills. I'll try to be brief so we can use maximum time for testimony. Be glad to answer your questions, but I want to go over a couple things up. For the record, Senator Bill Kraus, representing the 824 district, presenting Senate Joint Resolution 20 and Senate Bill 594. Senate Joint Resolution number 20 is a simple constitutional amendment that would allow the General Assembly to implement a photo ID requirement. You may ask yourself, why would you need to do this? In April 2015, Greene County prosecutor received complaints about a woman double voting. In the same April election, mayor-elect in Kinloch, Missouri, was barred from taking office due to possible voting fraud. 27 people voted from an abandoned building owned by the city. In May of 2014, we had a person that was collecting signatures for an initiative petition, had several signatures from deceased individuals on it. I put on your desk there I think I lost my copy. Oh, it's right here. An investigation by New York Department of Investigations on the New York Board of Elections. If you go to page 3, you'll find out that they have determined about 175 individuals that were either dead, moved, or convicted felons no longer eligible to vote. Of those 175 individuals, 63 individuals were still on the rolls. They had investigators actually posed as those 63 people, and out of those 63 individuals, 61 of them were able to get a ballot, mark it, and submit that ballot. 97% of the time, when a person was ineligible to vote, and a person that wasn't that individual went in to vote, and New York actually was allowed to do that. In the state of Missouri, without an ID, it's pretty easy to get somebody else's utility bill and go and potentially say, "Hi, I'm Bob Jones, I'm here to vote." And then that's all you need in the state of Missouri is a utility bill. This constitutional amendment would allow voters in the state of Missouri to say, "Hey, we want our Constitution to allow the General Assembly to implement a photo ID requirement." That's the joint resolution. The fiscal note, $7 million, that's a typical fiscal note on the joint resolution. The bill itself, it's a starting point. I am not married to this bill. This is where I started. Pretty simple. It requires either a driver's license, non-driver's license, military ID, or another form of government-issued ID. It has exemptions in there for the disabled, those that have a religious exemption, and those born before 1941. They could say, hey, I object, and they could file an affidavit for that purpose. You could do a provisional ballot. If their signature matches, that provisional ballot would be counted. That's a basic summary of what that bill does. I will tell you that the fiscal note is a gross exaggeration. In a couple states that have already implemented this and have paid for their photo IDs, I'll just bring up one of them is Alabama. Since 2011, only 1,300 people have applied to get IDs. The fiscal note has over 100,000 people in the state of Missouri actually applying and requesting an ID. And I think that's why it's so large for Senate Bill 594. That's a basic summary. Be glad to answer questions.
Any questions for the sponsor? Yes, Senator Sager.
Thank you. The physical and mental disability provision you have in there, how does the person prove this? I mean, do they have to get something from the doctor or from the physician, or can they just make a statement?
I would assume it would be a doctor's note.
Okay.
I'll verify that. I'll read that section, and if that's the section that bothers you, I believe that you should have some kind of doctor's verification that you are disabled, that you're saying you are.
And usually somebody with that type of disability has seen a physician in the past, and probably it was just taking a phone call.
Any other questions for the sponsor? Seeing none, do you have witnesses?
I don't know if there's anybody here to testify in favor, but I think there is.
Is there anyone else here to testify in favor?
Before we go there, Mr. Chairman, I will note that I have over 2,000 signatures of people that I have visited with that have signed to support voter ID as I've traveled the state. So I've got those right here.
All right. I'm going to ask you, you're welcome to come up first. You had your hand up first. Each side's going to get no more than 20 minutes. And I'm hoping you're not going to take even half of that. So keep it short, concise, and let us know what you think.
My name is Paul Evans. I am a Kansas City, Missouri resident, and I just want to remind the committee of the most flagrant voter fraud case that I am aware of and that made national news in 2010 in August, the 40th House race in a neighborhood not too far from where I live. In fact, I worked with people from that area at one time in an educational support group. There was a case of John J. Rizzo and Will Royster in a contested election, which was won by one vote. There were later, subsequently, convictions for 2 false voter registrations or ballots cast by Mr. Rizzo's relatives. And there was a 100-page document produced by the Royster campaign of flagrant voter violations attested to by election judges. And what really concerns me as much as anything is, number one, that the voter fraud occurred, and number two, there seems to be no consequences because of that. And I realize there were various mitigating circumstances. But the judge, for example, who denied a re-election, a ballot-by-ballot count, was subsequently appointed to a political office in the Jefferson County government. So the whole thing stinks to high heaven. And this will help mitigate it. I mean, nothing will eliminate illegal activity totally, just like speed limits don't eliminate speeding, but certainly it would make it much easier to enforce. My wife's an election judge, and generally they don't have any trouble at all with polls, and this would just expedite that. And I won't put any more of your.
Thank you very much. Questions for the witness? Okay, did you fill out a witness form?
No, I did not.
We'll need that. Thank you very much for your testimony. You're next. By the way, before we start, I want to welcome Senator Shoup to the committee. I believe this is your first hearing.
It is. Thank you. Good to be here. May I ask a quick question?
Absolutely. Please.
Yes. Good afternoon. A question for you about your 2,000 signatures. How did you verify that those were legitimate signatures?
Those are individuals that I saw on the campaign trail.
So are those people that you knew?
Individually, no.
So you just assume that whatever they signed is Okay, I got it.
Here's what I'm trying to do, Senators. A lot of times we come up here and people aren't able to travel up here to testify. And I wanted to make sure that people understood in this building how important it is to people out in the state of Missouri.
I understand. I'm just saying you're not asking for verification of those people's identification. And yet you're asking for verification for people who are going to want to vote in our, a basic right in our country. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, take off.
Thank you, Chairman and members. I'll keep nice, short and sweet as well. Photo ID is a simple measure to ensure only those that are supposed to be voting are voting. Our election process is degraded when illegal and fraudulent votes are cast by limiting votes cast by law-abiding citizens. And that's why we support photo ID.
Good. Questions for this witness? Thank you. Please fill out witness form. Hey, anyone else to testify in favor of Senate Committee Substitute Senate Bill 594 and SJR 20? In favor? Okay, that will open up. How many do want to testify against? Okay, you're going to get about 5 minutes at most. That's about all I can allow each one to have. So whoever wants to go first, you are welcome to come up. You usually testify last. This time you're up here first.
I try to go first typically. Maybe I just haven't been that memorable. I'm John Scott from the Secretary of State's office. Excuse me, and I will try to be brief because I know there probably are some other folks who want to testify as well. Secretary of State's office can't support any legislation that would disenfranchise a single eligible Missouri voter. Said that in past years. Testified to the same thing this year. The Secretary of State likes to say that as a state chief elections official, it's his job to make sure not only eligible voters vote, but that eligible voters, all eligible voters, have the opportunity to vote. That being said, I always like to sort of take a step back and discuss with the committee what the committee is actually being asked to do through the joint resolution to legislation. The committee is being asked to revisit an issue that's, I think this year will be a decade old in Missouri, and go back on what the Supreme Court has said in a Wasson decision in 2006, and effectively weaken the state's existing voting rights provisions to weaken the Constitution to allow for one of the most restrictive forms of photo ID in the country to be passed. And that really is what the committee is being asked to do. Weaken voting rights provisions that are in the Constitution to allow for the most restrictive, arguably, piece of photo ID in the country. And I think most Missourians, if asked and if they took a look at the legislation, would be a little surprised at how restrictive it really is. It wouldn't allow for student IDs, out-of-state driver's licenses, even the voter ID cards that a county clerk or election authority issues to folks. And, the way that the legislation, I guess, tries to accommodate for some of the folks, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that wouldn't have that ID or have access to that ID, doesn't fully and adequately protect their right to vote. By putting them on a provisional ballot, it puts their vote at risk. And that's just not something that we can support in terms of putting eligible Missouri voters' voting rights at risk. We know, and I've said this year after year, the types of individuals that are less likely to have the identification that the legislation calls for. And this is from census data from the last few years. Households without a vehicle in Missouri, we're talking about over 170,000 households without a vehicle. You don't own a car, you're going to be less likely to have the driver's license, less likely to have the ID required by the legislation. People who take public transportation, similar rationale, you're going to be less likely to have that ID. We're talking about over 35,000 Missourians. Missourians over the age of 75, close to 400,000. Missourians in poverty, we're talking about 800,000. We know all this, we've talked about this for years, and we know about the availability of alternative proposals in other states. We know about some of the reservations that past judges that have even ruled in favor of photo ID legislation have had about their actions on the bench and what they've said publicly, deeply regretting their decisions to validate photo ID laws. So none of that stuff's new. Obviously, again, I just reiterate that we can't support any legislation that disenfranchises single eligible consumer voter.
Any questions? Any questions for the witness? Yes,
I just have a quick question for me.
go right ahead.
Are you going to be testifying on the other bill, the other photo ID bill? Is that the Senate bill?
I think they were both together, the joint resolution
Are you
and the
proposing
bill.
them both together? 'Cause
Yeah, they were put together.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm
So I
sorry.
do have some questions.
I think you just walked in when I started that sentence.
Yeah, I apologize for being a little bit late. So in the bill itself, it talks about that these photo IDs are going to be paid for subject to appropriation. Tell me about that. What does that mean in terms of, what if money is not appropriated? Can you tell me what the outcome of that would be?
So I think you're talking about the section, correct me if I'm wrong, the section that says, I think it's on page 6, page 5, the actual bill 594.
Yes.
Says that election authority costs associated with the implementation shall be reimbursed from general revenue subject to appropriation.
Right.
I think, that the sponsor obviously would have to speak to the intent of that, but as I've looked at the legislation, as our office has looked at the legislation, and there's some similar provisions in the House bill that says, we'll provide birth certificates subject to appropriation. When you start talking about treating fundamental rights like they're subject to appropriation, that's pretty dangerous, pretty slippery slope. When you start, I don't think it protects the integrity of elections to say you've got a fundamental right to vote as long as it's subject to appropriation. That I think it could potentially confuse eligible Missouri voters when they have to wonder what's in conference committee substitute for Senate committee substitute for, blah, 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 House Bill 12 each year, whether the photo ID provisions are going to be put in law. I think it potentially is confusing to election authorities. You basically would be putting this appropriations committee in charge of election policy. A little troubling to look at that, to put it lightly.
Right, and I would think that it's so confusing to the voter. I think, I've gone to the polls to vote, and currently sometimes people ask me for my photo ID, or people around me, because a lot of them know me there. And I want to say, and I've said they don't need to provide a photo ID currently. When we have a law out there that says, yes, you do need to, but not right now because we didn't appropriate the funds, I think that a lot of people are going to say, I don't know what I need. And you know what, this is just way too hard and way too much trouble, and I may not go. And for the few people that we have been given examples of that may be doing something they're not supposed to do, or impersonating somebody, or going to my house and taking my gas bill to pretend that they're me to vote, we're going to disenfranchise a whole lot of people. And the whole idea is that who we elect, who we send to represent us, should be democratically decided by getting as many people to vote as we possibly can. I have never heard anybody say the turnout at that last election was way too big, right?
Right.
I mean, that just isn't what happened. And so we're putting something into place that I think confuses the voters. That's what I'm hearing you say is first of all, we're leaving it in the legislature's hands each time around to determine who needs an ID, or whether people need a photo ID or not.
Yeah, you would be by definition through the language of the bill saying that the ID requirements are going to change or subject to change each year based on appropriation levels. And, there's a lot of talk about integrity and preserving the integrity of elections, and that's obviously something that our office believes a great deal in. It doesn't preserve the integrity of elections whenever you create confusion from year to year for people.
I have another question for your office. Do we have any polling places currently in federal buildings in the state of Missouri?
Polling places in federal buildings.
For example, in a post office, do they ever have a polling place in a federal building?
I would have to check on that. I think there were 2,500 polling places in
Right.
the 2012 general election, so I can definitely check.
Right, I know that they must be going into a lot of different buildings. I know several of the school districts in my community have decided not to utilize them as polling places because they're concerned about people they don't know coming into the buildings. So my question around that goes to, currently we have driver's licenses that in 2 years, if we don't do something to change them, won't meet the federal requirements that allow us into federal buildings. So in 2 years, it's conceivable that even our current driver's license, which is one of the few things that it's allowed to, that is provided as something allowing us to vote, won't even let us into the building where we're supposed to be voting. I'm just saying we have a lot of things going on in Missouri. We're not going to allow students to use their IDs in this new legislation. We're not going to allow photo IDs that are legitimately used photo IDs both in high schools and colleges. And I'm wondering what your estimate is of the number of people that will be disenfranchised under legislation like the senator has proposed.
What we've said in the past is that it's an estimated approximately 220,000 people in Missouri that could be potentially disenfranchised by the legislation.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Any other questions for the witness? Thank you. Please fill out a witness form. Next. And brevity will be appreciated. John took a little longer than his 5 minutes.
Sorry.
Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Allison Dreeth. I'm the Executive Director of NARAL Pro-Choice Missouri. NARAL was founded in 1969 and is the largest grassroots organization working to protect reproductive freedom in the state. Now, you would may ask why I'm here testifying against Senate Bill 594 and Constitutional Ballot Resolution SJR20. But I'm here today as an organization that stands to protect women and as a woman myself. So having ID might seem like a simple requirement. 11% of voting 11% of voting age Americans don't have ID. That's 21 million people, according to the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. The numbers are even scarier for women. Only 66% of women voters have proof of citizenship that reflects their current name. As a newly married person, I do not have current identification that reflects my name. The vast majority of women change their names if they get married, and most voter ID rules requires that your registration name match your voter ID name exactly. While some women do have access to the entire chain of documents that connects their current name with their birth name, I am not one of those women, including birth certificates and marriage license. It's not always the case. The Missouri legislature has made difficult several years for women, not just and more restrictions towards abortion, but with the 10 years dedicated to trying to move this legislation forward. Women have seen their rights being risked in specific ways, and please don't making a trip to uphold one of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the witness? Thank you very much. Did you fill out a witness form?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Next.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marvin Sands. I'm from Independence, Missouri, and here to represent once again the 750,000 members of AARP in the state of Missouri. I've been an AARP member since 1990 and served as an advocacy member and a member of the Speakers Bureau. In addition, I served as an election judge and currently serve as a supervisory election judge and have served these capacities for the last 14 years. For at least the last 10 years, for at least the last 10 years, this issue, although ID, facing us today, has been going around the Capitol, and in this building, and in this state for which you all. It is time to put this to rest and get rid of this. First, it is far and away unconstitutional. And there was a decision made on that in 2006, and you remember that. And we're disenfranchised over 200,000 Missouri citizens by taking away the fundamental right to vote in the election held in the state of Missouri. The fundamental right is the constitutional right, and to remove constitutional right is the same as removing one of our very basic freedoms. Second, I very much understand the basic reason for pushing this legislation forward. And that basic reason is to avert what some, and especially one, is calling voter fraud. There are ample amounts of research and studies to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the voter fraud simply does not exist to an extent or at any level that would warrant such drastic action such as this legislation and its supporters suggest. In fact, voter fraud is not at all a threat to our election process, and quite frankly, it never has been. The Brennan Center for Justice has done extensive studies looking at committees on fraud in every state and has concluded that voter fraud is less than 3,000 of 1%. Also, a study of 2012 has concluded and found over 10 alleged cases of in-person voter impersonation in any election in the United States since the year 2000. In that same period of time, over 650 million votes were cast in general elections. During the arithmetic, we find this amounts to 0.000000015%. Folks, this very simply not voter fraud. Senator Kraus said on August 30th, 2015, episode of This Week in Missouri Politics that over 16 people in the state of Missouri have been convicted of some type of voter fraud. Although Senator Kraus never specified a time frame, his campaign had a report from the Heritage Foundation that pointed to 17 convictions since 2005. What is intriguing about this report is none of these cases involve voter impersonation, which is what voter ID laws are designed to combat. Instead, all 17 were convicted on false voter registration. That is completely different from voter fraud. Once again, folks, that's not a voter fraud problem. Even if it were, over that same period of time, about 15.2 million votes were cast, making that percentage 0.0000011 millionths of a percent. Once again, not a voter fraud problem. Those 17 of those cases, if considered under this bill, would have been averted by this proposal. Why? Because the amendment only applies to a voter seeking to vote in person, according to the assumption. Further, the Missouri Secretary of State's office runs an elections integrity unit, whose job is to monitor irregularities. The spokeswoman in that office up to November of last year said the unit hasn't handled any cases of voter impersonation fraud. And still further, the current spokeswoman recently said there hasn't been a documented case of voter impersonation. Facts are strong that voter fraud simply doesn't exist in the state of Missouri, which means that some other reason has to exist for this issue. To disenfranchise eligible voters by placing them in jeopardy, quite frankly, is un-American, and to remove from our Constitution a fundamental right to vote is also un-American. Please remember, voting is a constitutional right, a basic freedom that should not be hindered or eliminated. I served in the United States Air Force during the Vietnam War for 6 years and served to protect those basic freedoms, like voting. When I took the oath of office upon entering the Air Force, I swore to serve, defend, and protect the Constitution of the United States of America. I didn't serve to have someone offer a bill to remove my or any of my citizens' fundamental right to vote. please do not support this unnecessary piece of legislation that will indeed threaten a constitutional right.
Any questions from the witness? Thank you very much. Please fill out a witness form. I know you're going. You're always.
Indeed, Senator. I'll pay them after 3 we have concerns about the joint resolutions that are longstanding. The Wayne Tech decision, what the court is looking at, or my legislative committee goes look at that. Each government, they all work for elected officials. They're concerned that the change to the Constitution is a change to a provision that the court relied upon in their view to protect the voting rights of those at risk. That's my folks' concern. I want to, as I did last year, focus most of my remarks on the bill because in all earnesty, I think you all are the legislators and you all have the control over the language. The issue that I spoke to last year, that we brought up last year, that remains is profound concern over the workability of the bill to function at all, but rather that it's more likely to cause intense mayhem for our election process, beyond just the fact that we think that the policy is completely unnecessary. That question that's probably the hardest to get around is it okay that citizens won't know what the voting law will be from year to year? No, there is you can answer yes to that it's okay for that. But even if you said that it were, then you've got to start asking the questions about the details of the way the bill, as it stands, would affect the election process. Is it okay to put election authorities in the role of essentially courts in interpreting the law? One of the things that this bill doesn't do is it doesn't enumerate the process, the timeline, or who has the statutory obligation to determine if there has been, quote, no appropriation of state funds. It doesn't provide a process for the notification of election authorities. So it's likely to cause litigation and chaos if you guys do not appropriate funds. Also, the choice of the phrase no appropriation of funds probably doesn't really speak directly to what I would assume is the intent, and that is sufficient appropriations. If you appropriated $100, that wouldn't qualify as no appropriation, so it wouldn't meet the intent of the bill to provide the funding of the IDs. Even more profoundly than any of those questions is, if that trigger goes into effect, what law do the election authorities then implement? It doesn't speak to a specific provision that's stricken. It says that the election authorities shall not implement the photo identification provisions of the section, but they're not enumerated. The law is very specific in what it says. Persons seeking, in the new language, persons seeking to vote in a public election shall establish their identity and eligibility to vote at the polling place by presenting a form of personal identification to election officials. No form of personal, it doesn't use the photograph, no form of personal identification other than the forms listed in this section shall be accepted to establish a voter's qualification to vote. And then it lists forms of personal identification. What is the law that the election authority would then implement if they are directed that the photo identification provisions are not to be implemented? If this bill becomes law, in addition to the policy concerns, the chaos and mayhem that would then result in the election process, our estimation that is not the intention of the legislature, but we see it as a likely consequence of this legislation. For those very many reasons, we are strongly opposition.
Thank you. Any questions for us? Thank you very much. Next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Senator Rossi, Director of Advocacy and Policy with the ACLU of Missouri. I think the testimony preceding me has covered most of the points that I would ever cover, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. I do want to say I met with Senator Kraus over the interim. We had a very good and long conversation about voter ID. I think the one thing we agreed on completely was that the voting process and the right to vote is something that should be protected, and it's the state's responsibility to protect that right to vote. We have different views on what protecting the right to vote means, though, and that's because, while I understand what Senator Kraus is trying to do with this bill, but the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional right. And the state government and the federal government can't infringe upon one of your fundamental constitutional rights without a legitimate state interest or a legitimate governmental interest. any amendment or any law that has been passed by the federal government regarding the right to vote has been to expand that right. The Voting Rights Act was meant to expand that right to more people of color, especially in the South. There are no less than six amendments in the U.S. Constitution that protect the right to vote. The First Amendment protects it as a freedom of expression. The 14th Amendment protects it as a right of citizenship. The 15th Amendment makes it unbiased. The 19th Amendment makes it ungendered. And the 24th Amendment opens it to everybody regardless of income or ownership of property. There hasn't been a time in the history of the federal government when the law changed for voting rights that in any way subtracted from the amount of people that would be allowed to vote. The legitimate government interest here is just it's a matter of math. Even if we take all of the alleged instances of in-person voter fraud and gave it a generous number in the state of Missouri, all 100, which I think is very generous, and weighed that against the hundreds of thousands of Missourians who would have another hurdle placed in front of them in order to access a polling place, the numbers don't add up. The legitimate governmental interest here should be increasing our voter turnout. And Missouri is lucky if we get close to 60% voter turnout in a major election. We should be doing everything we can to increase the right to vote, to increase voter turnout, and try to reach 100% voter turnout. And we do that by expanding early voting, by expanding absentee voting, by providing free transportation to polling places, by providing more polling places instead of closing them in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are filled with people of color. This is the opposite. These bills are the opposite of what we should be doing to protect the right to vote in Missouri. And I think it's really just simple logic and simple math that explains that. We should be hitting 100%, not trying to whittle ourselves down from the 60% we already got. I'm very opposed to the bill. I'm sure you can tell. My face is turning a little red, but I appreciate your time and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. Anyone with questions? Thank you very much for your testimony.
This is my first time. So my name is Rachel Greathouse, and I am an intern at Empower, Missouri. And I want to oppose SB 594 and SJR 20. The paper that's being passed around shows 4 groups that I believe will be suppressed due to these 2 bills. First, people who are living in poverty, as mentioned earlier by Sarah Wasson, those who are transgender and living in transition periods, persons with disabilities, and women. But I'm also a student studying for my master's in social work, so this bill would also affect students like me who cannot use their student ID as a form of verification to vote. I believe students are just beginning to learn their rights as an adult, but will not have the opportunity to exercise, and this discourages young adults from voting. This next generation is very politically active, and they are one of the largest voting populations. In conclusion, voting is the one time that we are all equal, rich, poor, young, old. And while we should take responsibility for understanding the rules and complying with voting rights, we shouldn't make voting rights harder than it needs to be.
Thank you very much. You did well for your first time. Anyone else? Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Please fill out a witness form. Yep. Anyone else?
I'm Nimrod Chappell. I'm the president of the Missouri State NAACP Conference. Pleasure to be with you today, and I appreciate you affording so many folks an opportunity to talk about why they think this legislation will ultimately disenfranchise voters. I can only echo the constitutional sentiments that have already been relayed to you. I can tell you as a practicing lawyer that litigation over these cases is long and involved and would undoubtedly follow implementation. But more pragmatically, I can tell you that as a person who recognizes and more importantly represents disenfranchised people, that this legislation has historic roots that we don't want to bring back to Missouri. Mexico has an ugly history all throughout America and the United States. It has history in Missouri. I mean, we've got monuments exhibits that talk about issues such as Dred Scott and ugly things that need not be mentioned. Having been the touchstone of the 2 largest civil rights issues to affect America or indeed perhaps the world including Ferguson and Mizzou, where people just recognize that their rights, their fundamental rights as citizens, to not be mistreated on the basis of color or race, can no longer be overlooked, whether it's the police doing it on one hand or administrators who refuse to participate on the other. I think that this would be another step that would only show that Missouri is walking backwards, adopting what can only be termed as a poll tax when it was struck down in 2006, and as an unfunded mandate going forward can only be anticipated as having the same effect. That's not the kind of Missouri that the NAACP wants to see for America. I can think that you can see from the number of organizations that we have here with us today that there are coalitions that are being formed that speak across broad spectrums, whether they are people who are joined or united by color, or age, or disability, or gender. These are your constituents. These are Americans who will no longer have the ability to participate in the most fundamental of democratic processes. And so I would urge you, please do not pass this bill in this joint resolution.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for this witness? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have 3 African Americans in the state Senate, none of whom happen to serve on this committee, and we are sitting here on the Tuesday after the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday. And as the newly named head of Missouri NAACP, congratulations, by the way. I just want to ask you, are you concerned that the legislation in front of us may disproportionately impact African American Missourians? And if so, could you please expound on that?
Unequivocally, Senator, that is my deepest fear, that the people that we have who are of color, whether it's African American, immigrant, or any other nationality, are people who are historically disenfranchised. These are folks who have been left out of not only the political system, but the economic system for decades. That this would mark a return to the same era that we fought so hard to get away from. The celebrations that went across the state yesterday for Martin Luther King Day, as well as the nation, want to talk about the successes that we as human beings have had in recognizing each other. Here we know, and I don't think that there's anybody that can deny that legislation that's been proposed now, or that's been adopted in other states, has a disproportionate impact on minority populations. The Secretary of State said quite eloquently that they're expecting that it'll be 220,000. The number that I hear, that it'll be about 250,000, and that most of those people are going to end up being people of color. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions for the witness? Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, come right ahead. How many more have we got? You? That's it? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman and committee, I am Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, pastor of one of the oldest churches in the state, Quinn Chapel AME Church, as well as the executive director of Missouri Faith Voices, which represents a multi-faith group of about 400 congregations throughout the state. It's actually with great distress that I have to come, as the senator pointed out, the day after Dr. King's holiday, 51 years after the March on Selma. I'm originally from Alabama. It's a march that, the initial march, my mother, then a college student, was injured by a police officer who attacked some of those who were marching and left this earth with a gash on her leg. And she talked about that gash and showed it to us to remind us that she fought so that my brothers and my sister and myself could have the opportunity to the right to vote. I remember my 18th birthday when my parents, before allowing me to open one gift, picked me up from school because they wanted to take me down to the public library so that I could be registered to vote. I'm struck that I've sat in on and testified in many of the House of Representatives hearings around similar legislation, and I'm always struck that there seems to be these ambiguous figures, or sometimes what I think is mythological people with no names, or references to possibly one name down in Webster County, if I remember correctly, or issues that happened in the city of St. Louis about 15 years ago, which were really more about unmaintained registration rolls than they were about fraud. I implore this committee that if the real issue is voter fraud, then that really is a judicial issue, and that we do have actual laws against that. That includes not just financial restitution, but also prosecution. You all may not know the names of those that you say are committing fraud or those that have been affected by fraud, but I sit here as a person of clock, indicating, as I said, representing multi-faith groups from across the state. 51 years after countless people were killed, people such as Reverend George Lee, who wasn't a resident of Mississippi, but he was a pastor who was encouraging other people to vote, who was killed in the state of Mississippi because he encouraged other people to vote. 51 years after working so that people who looked like me could vote, James Earl Chaney and Andrew Goodman and Michael Henry Schwartman, young civil rights workers, were murdered for their attempts to make sure that I had the right to vote. I represent Anthony Williams, a young man who's now a member of my congregation, who in the city of St. Louis at age 14 was wrongly convicted of a murder and spent 20 years in jail. Fortunately, on July 3rd, 2014, he was released. One of his proudest moments over the last year and a half has been the day that he was registered to vote. Under the proposed legislation, his provisional ballot would be null and void and basically worth the same thing that a piece of toilet paper would be worth if the election had been held while we were waiting 4 weeks for him to obtain his birth certificate from the state of California. It's 51 years after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, a law that in a publication on the effects of the Voting Rights Act, the U.S. Department of Justice indicated this law was the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever to be passed in the history of our country, and that was in 2009. 10 years after the Missouri Supreme Court ruled that these such legislative attempts are unconstitutional. 59 years after Dr. King made his impassioned speech during a prayer pilgrimage for freedom, give us the ballot. I implore you on behalf of faith leaders and those that we represent to protect our ballot. Protect our ballot so that the children from Lincoln University that my church proudly registers every year, at this point, hundreds of children, young people who've been registered, will be turned away under this proposed legislation, many who only have their school IDs, and that will no longer be sufficient. So that my parishioners, some of them who are over the age of 70, who weren't born in Missouri, won't have to have their right that they saw some of their peers die for be denied, so that disabled people like my friend Wayne, who you're about to hear from, and my well-educated but blind friends Debbie Corman and Reverend Russell Mule, whose signatures most often than not don't look the same, won't have their access to voting, depend on the eyes of some election official. Please protect our right to vote on behalf of citizens all over this state.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the witness? Thank you very much, Pastor.
There's some technical. Oh, yeah. You know, I said in the House Committee, and I say to you as well, ID. I don't know that I need to be talking to you about my identification. I think maybe I need to talk to my doctor about that. I don't have Alzheimer's disease yet. I already know who I am. Voters' rights are voters' rights. And you've heard everything that everybody else has said. I don't need to do any more than just say I echo and agree, most definitely, with my friend and our president of the NAACP, I'm a member of now, and the executive director of Faith Voices, and I'm on the local board of, and Anthony Williams serves on that board. And The testimony you have in front of you, you might think is a little bit strange for this bill. Because the first part of it is a quote that was sent to me by a friend yesterday. A quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was talking about his eulogy, what he wanted it to be about. And he'd go ahead and he remembered for just caring for those who were in need. If you read it, you'll see it clearly, right there. The people who were hungry. What it comes right down to is it comes right out of Matthew 25, 31 through 46. The least of these, and they're really not the least of these anymore. They're equal to everybody else. But if this bill passes, they're going to be knocked back into oblivion. Many people will not be allowed to vote as a result of that. That includes some people with disabilities. And then another quote follows, one that I've grown to love. But if you think about it, it really, really carries the weight of this whole thing. If you really think about what your power is all about. Because King wrote it in his last book, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is implementing everything that stands in the way of love. If this bill goes into effect, you're not implementing justice. You're blocking people from participating in American life, exercising their right to vote. And I'm asking you, please, really reconsider before we pass the vote. That's my request of you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Anyone questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. Anyone else testify against? Seeing none, anyone to testify for informational purposes only? Seeing none, that will close the hearing on Senate Committee Substitute Senate Bill